Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and I am here today with Dr. Jenn Phoenix Hatfield. Welcome, Jenn. It's so great to have you here.
It's good to be back.
Can you give us a little thumbnail of what you would like us to know about you before we jump into our conversation?
Who I am today is different than who I was the last time we spoke, and I'm sure it's going to be different than what we speak, well, when we speak next.
Yes.
And I think I may have said that before, but it's a reminder that to be living beings, we are consistently evolving and changing, and that's a really good thing.
Yes.
So much of our lives, at least in mine, I was trying to create stability and sameness in some way, and what I've come to discover is the fact that I change from day to day is a really good thing.
It is. Very much. Okay, so is there anything today that you wanted to say who you are today specifically?
I am someone who is continuing to discover me and the magic that's available with me. And it's become clear that one of the most important ways to do that is to allow space in my life to listen and respond to my inner voice.
Perfect. And that's where we were going to go with our topic today. So I am totally in agreement with both of those. And I've been really actively working on space and looking at all of the things that are in my life and what do I sort of let go of or put to the side, because like you, I've been wanting more space. And I think when we're in a time of great change, you know, when you don't have space, you tend to do the same things again and again because that's sort of your rote autopilot way of getting through the world. But right now there's this great opportunity to be something different and to make changes intentionally or to allow change to flow. But in order to do that, in my experience, you need space to be able to allow that to happen rather than, you know, well, you've got 5 minutes to get from here to here. That's all the space you have. There's no, you know, you can't get into that new flow with space. So what is it that, like for you, like how are you creating space in your life and what does that mean to you?
Well, certainly creating space in life, I often compare it to when we declutter a space in our home, a space in our office, when we purge and let go of things that we haven't used or maybe even forgot that we had because it's been tucked away or in a box or in a closet or something somewhere. So one of the ways that I can feel lots of space is to do that periodically, both in my physical space, but also within myself.
And so how do you do it within yourself? Like because I do the physical space thing, and I know for me, when I create time, for me, I create space. Like to me, those two go together in my life. And so how do you create space in yourself? Oh, and also when I let go of beliefs, when I let go of things like limitations and all of those kinds of things that clutter up my psyche, that creates that kind of space as well. But for me that like spaciousness is also about having time to allow that process and do that process without it feeling like there's an agenda of any sort. So how do you create space within?
Well, I think one of the most important pieces is deciding that this is a priority, that it's important for me to have space, to have freedom, to be flexible. And to do that, it goes in my schedule. And it is time that I can put aside to do things that don't require me to have my mind be really active.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be things certainly like hiking in nature, spending time sitting in my backyard, like staring at a tree,
Mm-hmm.
or hugging a tree. It can be, for me, abstract art, because again, I'm not trying to create something specific for it to look or be a certain way when I'm done. It can be meditation, but whatever it might be, it starts with me giving myself permission to give myself that time, and ideally to schedule it, because it is in fact a priority. And it goes back to what we started this with, is where's the space for your inner voice to speak to you so you can
Mm-hmm.
hear it and respond to it.
Right. So, and you followed your inner voice with what you were doing, and I followed my, doesn't really come as a voice to me, but for me, it is really more this inner rising of intuition and that kind of thing. But that's another thing that I think this this time of change, and there's a lot of change going on. And sometimes it creates spaciousness, sometimes it creates, a lot more work or anxiety. If you've got kids and they were trying to learn at home and you were trying to work from home, there might not have been any space. But there's this, in this time of real change, we talk to ourselves, or could talk to ourselves and listen to ourselves in a different way. And I know it's hard oftentimes, especially if this is a new concept for people, to understand what their inner voice is, because we have, there's the voices in the head, and if you have one opinion, you'll have like 45 other opinions in your head that will pop up, in response to that opinion. And that can feel like an inner voice, especially if one's louder than the other, or one is more persistent, or one is your mother's voice, and that's the one that tends to talk to you. But there's also, but there's that deeper inner voice that's really unique to us, that's harder to hear, because when the world is noisy and your mind is noisy and life is noisy, it gets drowned out. So let's talk about that inner voice for a little bit. And how do you recognize your inner voice?
That's an interesting question. How do I recognize it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know how I recognize it now. I found myself trying to think back, like, how did I first recognize it when I didn't necessarily know what it was? An example that came to mind, and I've heard this consistently from a lot of the people that I work with or talk to, that one place that they hear their inner voice is typically in the shower.
Mm-hmm.
That if there's one place, I probably hear that answer more than any other place. It's this, voice of inspiration, or this voice that just has like this clarity that you have to pay attention to. And it seems
Yeah.
like the answer, the right answer, the answer comes in this moment of inspiration when you're sitting there, rinsing the shampoo out of your hair or something.
And something I want to say about that too is it comes, because I've had that experience too. Of course, then you can't take notes. So then if you don't really pay attention to it, it leaves you. But one quality I find about that shower time when the inner voice comes is that it's a time where you're not actively thinking of something else. You're having to track what you're doing. So that have you shampooed your hair? Have you rinsed, what you're doing in the shower, but it doesn't require that kind of analytical thought. So there's this dip, this lull that you're not, it's like when I get a lot of this kind of stuff when I'm driving. So not when I'm really focused on driving, like if it's raining and there's a lot of traffic and I have to really pay attention, but that those times where, the autopilot goes on when you're
Mhm.
driving and you're kind of watching and seeing things. And so part of your mind is active with that. But for the most part, there's more spaciousness and it gives that opportunity for other information to rise. Because that's been my experience in the shower too, is if I'm actively thinking of something, that's going to drown out the voice. But when I'm paying attention to what I'm doing without over focusing, that's when the voice kind of pops in and says, "Hello, I'm here. I have something to say."
Yes, and where I would say that I recognize my inner voice, I mean, probably one of the parameters or one of the things on my checklist, if I were to have one between what's my inner voice and what's not, is if I'm focused in my mind
Hmm.
and trying to figure it out,
Yeah, that's a killer.
that's not my inner voice.
Yeah,
That the information, the the information, the inspiration, the aha, the answer, I feel like it comes more like up and from within me than my head. I'm
yeah.
really clear that it does not come from my head and it does not come from thinking.
No, and thinking, and it's funny. I did this post on Facebook one day that I found this. It turned out, I think, to be a red hawk feather that I've never seen, but it was huge. It was beautiful. And it was right at that time where I decided that thinking, I was done thinking. And I wasn't like I was done sorting things out and stuff, but I was done with that constant trying to figure things out in my mind. But I posted that on Facebook and people were just aghast. What do you mean you're going to stop thinking? How are you going to live your life and all this stuff? And I thought, I wasn't really clear about that to me, but I was clear about it within me and the people who got it, that I was done with thinking as a way to navigate my life and solve my problems. And I've been working on that for years and years, but it was kind of one of those death knell things that I was like done. I was like cutting the cord. That was it. And I still find myself doing it, but not nearly as much. And then I found the feather and there was this great meaning in the feather and all that. But people were so aghast when I said that I was done with thinking. And the idea that we have that the way that we navigate life is through thought and through ideas and through problem solving, that everything in life that's like not convenient at the moment is a problem and we need to use our mind to solve it. And I've been there and it's very anxiety producing and the mind only knows what it knows. It doesn't have any extra information or insight or inspiration to give. And it shuts down the inner voice. And the inner voice is the one that brings that new inspiration, the new ideas, the new awareness, the new way of being in the world. But it's interesting how much of a pushback I got when I said I was done thinking.
Absolutely. Well, you think about it from a very young age,
Hmm.
we're taught to identify the problem and solve it.
Yes.
And it tends to be very linear and it tends to be very limited. Yeah, we tend to go with the responses that come pretty easily. And we
Hmm.
might, if we're trying to solve something, we might move in the direction of, like two or three responses to look at. And only if those, either don't work or obviously won't work, do we tend to dig deeper. And
And
that's
it's still often with thought. Like it
right,
still tends to go
right.
with like, how do I think more about this?
And that's reinforced, of course, throughout our school years, through if you
Hmm.
go to college and beyond, and it's reinforced typically at work, and then how we choose to go about our day.
Yeah, and very little original stuff comes from thought. Like even when you talk to people or hear about stories about people who come up with great inventions or great ideas, they don't do it by thinking about it. They do it by kind of posing the question or wondering about like what's possible here, and things come in a dream or they come in an inspiration or they come in a flash of awareness that contains the entire picture, but that's not something that they've learned, but it might stitch together a lot of the things they've learned in a different way to bring out a new way of looking at things or experiencing things, but it doesn't come from thinking about them. It comes from this rising up from within. And I notice for me that oftentimes the inner voice doesn't come like thought comes in bits and pieces. You know, you've got A and then you've got B and then you've got C, and then you need to figure out how to get D from those. But to me, the inner voice comes with a complete package, with a complete inspiration. And it may not be like the whole inspiration, like if you're writing a book, which is what I like to do. You know, it may not be the whole book, or it may be the whole idea of a book, but not all the details of it. I know J.K. Rowling said that she had the whole download of the whole series of Harry Potter, like as one big flash of inspiration. And I might have a container of a story and characters that are there, but and have that as an inspiration, but not every single detail, because those are little inspirations along the way. But it comes as its own packet of information, as opposed to thoughts that I think about in a sequential fashion that we call rational thought.
Absolutely. And to me, that's where space becomes so important, to be able to, one, allow that inner voice to come through in a way that we can receive it and respond to it. Often we fill every single moment of our time with something. Yes. Whether it's, okay, we've got a few minutes so I can take care of this task or that task, or I can, while I'm taking care of this, I can call so-and-so. You know, we're multitasking, and we're not comfortable sitting still. We're not comfortable being quiet. And now with technology, you know, we pick up a cell phone, we pick up an iPad, some iPad, or some other handheld device. We're listening to podcasts and audiobooks and watching movies or a TV show or whatever. I mean, all of that's available to us. And as a result, we're spending even more time, at least this has been my experience and what I observe, we're spending even more time in our head, in that logical thinking, or that, that very limited part of our brain.
Or even in, I find, the mental construction. So we've got when podcasts or shows or different things constantly reinforce, and the news does this as well, constantly reinforces our mental constructions about things, about this group of people, about how this is supposed to work, about what an economy is supposed to do, about how my life is supposed to be. Like, our whole life is really these huge series of interconnected mental constructions. And every time we watch or listen to or think about something that reinforces that mental construction, it takes us further away from really experiencing reality or possibility of what could be. Because if it doesn't come inside of a mental construction, there's no space for it to bring us into a different way of looking at something. And that's one of the beautiful things right now, is that a lot of our constructions are just collapsing. And so that creates a whole different kind of spaciousness that we can try to fill up with, like, well, how do we recreate this or make this incrementally different? Or how can we reimagine something using the inner voice and that higher intuition and higher awareness and spaciousness to imagine what's possible beyond any construction we've ever had about how things are supposed to work.
You know, there's an example that I probably will continue to use as long as it's relevant, but where somebody I know, her husband worked for a company that had been talking about going virtual, where people could work remotely and work from home. And the conversation, and it was in process, but the conversation was, this is going to take 3 years. And when the pandemic happened and self-isolation and quarantines happened, this company managed to do it in 3 weeks.
It's amazing what's possible when you like have to do it.
Right.
And you're just like, okay, this is our new normal. Let's adapt on the fly.
It goes back to, we've got to look outside the norms. And when you were talking about this construction, and one tying to another. And if you think about it, I mean, I know I do it. If I'm going to listen to a podcast or an audio book, they tend to follow certain lines of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
or certain topics or things that I enjoy. They're not typically, at least 80% of the time, they're within something that I already at least know something about.
Mm-hmm.
They're not something that's probably going to change, or have me looking at something from an entirely different perspective. Now, with that said, I have consciously started choosing different topics, different, going different directions to be able to hone that skill, to be able to break down those those things that have been constructed, so that way in itself can create more space and allow my inner voice to also come through, versus the patterns and behaviors that I have repeated consistently across, much of my life, can be changed. That thought process can be opened to new possibilities.
Yeah, one of my fun things to do, and I've done it my life through travel and different sorts of things, is to really become aware of my own assumptions and question my own assumptions. And one of the ways you do that is by exactly what you've been doing, listening to something or watching something that's completely different than your constructions, and look at that not as wrong, which is often a tendency. If something is so different, it must be wrong, but to allow that to begin to soften your constructions and assumptions about the world and open you up to new possibilities and ideas and ways of being and thinking and operating. And I think right now, especially as we're moving through, we had the pandemic and we've got the economic fallout, which will probably continue, and the pandemic will continue, and now we have this huge movement of rethinking policing, of rethinking race relations, of rethinking, how we look at people in society. And it's a great opportunity to spend some time looking at different material and different ideas than what you had ever considered was possible, to see what might, come together in the end, and what you might be able to open yourself up to that just never seemed like it was something that's possible in the past. To
You
be
know,
very
I,
general about it.
I think you hit on a key point too in that, though, is that when you choose, and choose, and obviously we didn't choose a pandemic, we
Yeah.
didn't choose, for people to be killed, so for there to be protests and riots, we didn't choose these things. But in finding ourselves in these situations, we have a choice of how we respond, certainly. And part of that choice is a willingness to say, just because it's not the way that I do it doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Yeah.
I think that's key, versus looking for the information out there that in some way will confirm, certainly for yourself, and then hopefully for others, that your way of thinking is the right way of thinking.
Yeah, that's never really it's never really the way to make great huge changes. And I think of these things that have happened, and I don't think we're done with things that are happening. I mean, I think it's a time that change is afoot. And even though we would not personally and have chosen pandemics and economic collapses and people dying and race, I don't want to say race riots, because really most of these protests are not.
Right.
They're peaceful protests that are looking for specific changes, but these are things that have chosen us, and they've chosen us in large, undeniable ways. And they've chosen us so that we can begin to look at ourselves and what's possible in a different way. And we have to look at so many things all at the same time. There's no way to piecemeal anything moving forward. We actually, with everything that's happening, and everything that may still happen, we need to begin to look at how our systems actually work and change how our systems work, change how society works and change how we work individually, and what are our assumptions, and what are things in our life that are stagnant, or that are on autopilot, that really would benefit by having some shift and change in what we do. And I think this is a perfect time to do that, because everything that has become kind of our normal operating procedure has been thrown up, onto the board, for another look. And it's really almost something that we can't, and we have to almost stick our head in the sand, not to begin to make these changes, but or take a look at these things. But the big way that we really need to look at them, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, is through letting that inner voice come up and lead us into something new, instead of trying to, cobble and recreate things that are familiar in a new and different way that really doesn't address some of these underlying issues that need to shift. Really giving us the opportunity to come into that way of being quite new and open and fresh in how we begin to move forward in our personal lives, by listening to our inner voice, which will give us the ability to be able to do this more widely, as a society, and as communities, and as groups of people within communities, to imagine things in a new way.
Yes, I've repeated these words on more than one occasion. It was a post, and it was by a woman of color, and I'm sure she was responding to some of what was going on in our community. And, she said, I don't want white people to feel shame for their whiteness and for their privilege. She says, I felt shame for the color of my skin most of my life. She went on to say, what I ask of you is that you take the time for your own healing, so that way you can show up and walk with me on this path that we're on. Yes. And I thought that was a beautiful way of, asking, and I would, on some level, reminding that it does start with us. And even though we're talking about, a lot of different things that are happening right now in the world, it goes back to space. What I'm seeing in so many places, whether it's because of fear, doubt, uncertainty, the fact that it's one thing after the other. You don't know who to trust. You don't know what information out there is reliable. Yeah. You don't know if it's safe to go out of your house or not. You don't know if you're immunocompromised or not. I mean, there's so many questions there. And what I'm seeing is a lot of people quick to react and respond without space.
Yes.
Somebody says something, somebody does something, and immediately there's a response. There's barely, there's really no space between what occurs and the response to it. That space to hear your inner voice literally has to start with space to not immediately respond to whether it's to somebody else or something within yourself. It's certainly can be a choice, and ideally would be a choice to say, okay, wait a minute. Even if I feel like I know how I want to respond, stepping back and saying, let me evaluate that or reevaluate that. At least let me take a breath.
Yeah. Well, and that's what, that whole old advice about take 10 breaths before you react is actually really good advice, because when something happens, the cascade in the body generally is that the nervous system reacts before the mind comes online. And even if, your inner voice has come up, it gets drowned out by the reaction of the nervous system, which is almost immediate. And it's in part because our fight flight reaction is also applied to emotions and not just physical things. So when something triggers you emotionally, we go into fight flight and we immediately respond to that emotion, even before like you've had that time to think about, is this really a good idea or not? Or is this who I really want to be in this moment? And taking a look at, wow, I'm having this huge reaction. Let's just step back for a moment and let that reaction flow through without giving it voice, and then be more thoughtful in how we respond and who we truly want to be in that moment versus reacting out of old patterns and habits. And when we remember that first impulse is almost always comes out of some kind of emotional wound, it can make it easier to not react in the moment, to take that breath, to diffuse that at that time, and say, give me a moment, give me a few breaths, and step back a little bit and give space to allow those deeper voices to come through. And even if that deeper voice can't come through because everything's noisy in the moment, you do have the opportunity to choose how you want to respond, whether you want to respond from that emotional triggering, or you want to be more thoughtful and say, you know what, I'm really, there's a lot up for me right now, and I want to take some time with this before I respond, and give yourself that time and that space to be able to create the space to hear that deeper stuff. Because when we get triggered, it takes a while oftentimes before we can really hear that deeper part of ourselves. So, don't feel bad if you need to take some time and create that space and not flash back in the moment, because actually I think this time is asking us and giving us the opportunity to take that collective breath, to step back for a moment, to not be in reaction, and to be in that place of more thoughtful, considered response.
Absolutely. Again, it's what will lead us to be able to hear our inner voice, recognize it as our inner voice, and then be able to respond to it.
So is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up this conversation?
What I would say is we have a choice. Mm-hmm. We have a choice to continue to move forward the way that we are, often in a triggered or survival mode response, mm-hmm. which is just going to keep us repeating the same things again and again and again. Mm-hmm. Or we have the choice to take a breath, to take a step back, to take 10 breaths, to give ourselves that space before we react, before we respond to what is often a trigger of some kind. And then the last thing I would say to that is, it's been my experience, and it's a reminder to myself as well as others, that if I'm triggered by something, it's an opportunity to heal.
Yes. All right. So do you want to tell people how they can reach you, and then we will sign off of this conversation?
Sure. I can be reached any number of ways. My website, theintuitivephoenix.com. It's also The Intuitive Phoenix is my Facebook business page. And I'm also on LinkedIn. Perfect.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Oh, it's always fun talking with you. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.